Hello, young math padawans. It's Mrs. Angel with your lesson for today on solving multi-step equations. So multi-step equations are equations that don't just take your normal properties of equality. We have to bring in some other tools from our toolbox here. So let's go through this little solving equations toolbox and talk about how we can tell whether or not we need to use any one of these tools. The first tool is our combining like terms, or CLT. And we can tell that we're going to use that tool if we have like terms on the same side of the equation. So that could mean that we have x's on the same side of the equation, or potentially constants on the same side of the equation. Anything that's on the same side of the equal sign that could be combined and simplified into a single term. The second tool in our toolbox is our distributive property. Now, there's one way that we can tell that we're going to use our distributive property, and that is if you see parentheses. If you see parentheses and specifically a value on the outside, that means that you will be using the distributive property at some point. And finally, we have our properties of equality. Properties of equality are the operations that we do to both sides of the equation to keep it true. And we use these properties to create zero terms and big one factors. So we're going to go through this video using the tools in the toolbox, and we're going to determine which tools we need to use and solve some equations. So grab your notes and let's get started. Okay, so the first equation that we're going to solve using our solving equations toolbox is 15 equals 3x minus 5 plus 2x. Go ahead and write down this equation along with your 3-column proof now. Great. So the first thing I always do is put a line down the middle of my equal sign to keep both sides completely separate. Now I'm going to look at my toolbox and figure out which tools I'm going to use. All right, let's start with combining like terms. Do I see like terms on the same side of the equation? Well, on the right side, I do see a 3x and a 2x, which leads me to believe that yes, I will be using the combining like terms tool at some point in my solving. What about the distributive property? Do you see any parentheses here? I don't, which means we will not be using the distributive property tool in this equation. And then I definitely see some terms with multiplication and addition, so we'll have to use our properties of equality to create some big ones and zero terms. So let's go ahead and take a look at our given equation here. The first thing I'm going to do is combine the like terms that I see. I see a positive 3x and a positive 2x. So I'm going to go ahead and combine or collect those into a single term. 3x's plus 2x's can simplify down to 5x's. I still have my negative 5 or minus 5 term, and I still have 15 on the left-hand side. So now I have successfully combined the like terms. Are there any other like terms here? Well, 15 is alone on the left side of the equation, and on the right side, I have a 5x and a 5, which are not like terms because one is a variable and the other is a constant. So I am done with that tool. Now I just have to use the properties of equality. Go ahead and use the properties of equality to continue solving this equation now. Great job. So I chose to use the addition property of equality next to create a zero term. I simplified to get 20 equals 5x. Then I used the division property of equality to create a big one factor, and I ended up with 4 as my solution. I'm going to go ahead and check that now.
15 equals 3 times 4x minus 5 plus 2 times 4. We'll find out. 15 equals 12 minus 5 plus 8. That's 7 plus 8. And 7 plus 8 is 15.
So because it made the equation true, I know that 4 is the solution to this equation. And we use the combining like terms and properties of equality tools from our toolbox. On to the next one. So we now have an equation 15 equals 2 times the group of 3x minus 5. Go ahead and copy down this equation now. I'm going to put the line down the middle of my equal sign, and then I'm going to take a look at my toolbox here and figure out what tools I'm going to use. So the first tool is the combining like terms tool. So on the left side, I only see a constant of 15. There are no other terms there. And on the right side, I see a variable term and a constant, which means I'm not going to be combining like terms on the right side either. So it appears that I will not be using the combine like terms tool. What about the distributive property? Do you see parentheses in this equation? Yes, we do have parentheses in this equation, which means we will eventually use the distributive property. And then because we have variable terms and constants, we are also going to be using the properties of equality. So let's get started. I'm going to start by using my distributive property and multiplying 3x and minus 5 by 2. That would simplify to 6x minus 10, because 2 times 3x is 6x and 2 times 5 is 10, and the 15 on the other side is not affected. So I started with my given equation, and then I applied my distributive property. Now I have a pretty simple two-step equation to solve. Go ahead and finish solving this equation now. Great, let's see how you did. So next I chose to use APO and create a zero term. That left me with the equation 25 equals 6x. I used depot to create a big one, and I've got this nasty looking fraction that I get to check. Ooh, lucky me. So I'm gonna go ahead and check that now.
15 equals 2 times 3 times 25 6 minus 5. Okay, now I notice here that 3 and 6 can be reduced down to 1 and 2. So I'm going to go ahead and rewrite this now. Now I have 15 equals 2 times 25 halves minus 5.
And I know that we're supposed to do parentheses first, but I don't really want to subtract 25 halves minus 5. So I'm going to simplify this using the distributive property.
So that's 2 times 25 over here, so the 2 will cancel. And I'll be left with 15 equals 25, and 2 times 5 is 10.
And 25 minus 10 is 15, which means 25/6 was the correct solution all along. And again, we were able to solve using our distributive property and properties of equality tool. Last example before we get into our workbook. 15 equals 2 times the group of x minus 5 plus 3x. Go ahead and copy down this equation and your 3-column proof now. Great. I'm going to start by putting a line down the middle of my equal sign. This one looks like it's got a lot going on. So let's take a look at our toolbox and figure out what tools we're going to use. Up first, will we be combining like terms here? Well, I only see 15 on the left, so I know that side doesn't have any. But on the right, I see an x term here inside of parentheses and an x term outside of parentheses. Because these are both like terms, that does lead me to believe that I will be using combined like terms at some point. Okay, what about the distributive property? Do you see any parentheses here? I do. I see parentheses right there in the middle, which means I will also be using my distributive property tool. And then again, because I've got a mixture of constants and variables, I'm going to have to create some big ones and zero terms using my properties of equality. So this equation is going to require all of the tools in our toolbox to solve. So let's get started. The first thing that I notice is that I have parentheses. And anytime you have parentheses, anything that's, unsimplified, I would suggest getting rid of those parentheses first. So the first tool that we're going to use is our distributive property. Notice that the only value that's being multiplied by 2 is that one term right there. This 3x is its own term off to the side. It's not being affected by that multiplication. So I'm going to apply the distributive property, but only to the term that is a product. So my first step here will be the distributive property. Let's simplify. 2 times x is a 2x, minus 2 times 5 is a 10. And then I can bring down my other term of plus 3x, and I can bring down the 15 that wasn't affected. So my distributive property tool has been used. I don't have any other parentheses to work with. What tool do you think we would use next? Well, believe it or not, you've got options. If you wanted to use combined like terms next, you would look at the 2x and the 3x and hope to combine them. Or if you want to use properties of equality next, you could add 10 to create a zero term and then continue solving. I would prefer to combine my like terms first, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. I have 2 x's plus 3 more x's, which combine to a single term of 5 x's. I'm going to bring down my minus 10 and my equals 15. Now that I've used my combine like terms tool, I only have one tool left in the toolbox, and that's our properties of equality. Now that this is a pretty simple two-step equation, why don't you finish solving? Okay, so after we did our distributive property and combined like terms, I chose to use APO to create a zero term, giving me a simplified equation of 25 equals 5x, followed by depot to create a big one factor, and I ended up with 5 equaling x I'm going to go ahead and check that work now.
15 equals 2 times 5 minus 5 plus 3 times 5. So 15 equals 2 times 0 plus 15. That's 15 equals 0 plus 15.
And 15 does equal 15, meaning that 5 is the correct solution to this equation. And that equation required every tool from that solving equations toolbox. Time for some practice problems in our workbook. So find these sets of problems. These are in Unit 7, page 12. I'll wait until you have those problems in front of you. Okay, let's get started. So number 1, we have 3 times the group of 3x plus 4 minus 4 equals 53. My first step, as always, is to put a line down the middle of my equal sign, and then I'm going to use the toolbox over here to figure out what tools will we be using. Well, do I see any like terms? I do see a 3x inside of parentheses here, but that's the only 3x on the side. In fact, that's the only x term on that side. So that's not going to be combined. I do see a constant inside of parentheses and a constant outside of parentheses. So it looks like, yes, we will have the option to combine like terms here. We would just be combining constants. Do you see parentheses here? Yes, I see parentheses right there in that group of 3x plus 4, which means we'll also be using the distributive property tool. And then because we have a combination of constant and variable terms, we're going to have to make some big ones and zero terms using our properties of equality. Again, we have some options here. We do have the option of distributing first. Could we also combine first? Well, let's see. This constant is inside of a group, and that group is being multiplied by 3, which means that value isn't actually 4. It's 3 times 4. So I can't combine these two until those parentheses are dealt with. So it seems to me like the only first logical step here, unless I wanted to use APO, would be to start with our distributive property. Again, keep in mind that this is a single term. This is the product of 3 times 3x plus 4, and this minus 4 is not affected by that multiplication. So I'm going to start by distributing 3 to 3x and 3 to my positive 4. 3 times 3x is 9x. 3 times 4 is a plus 12. I'm going to bring down my additional term and my equal sign, 53. So now I've used the distributive property in my toolbox, and I no longer have parentheses. What could I do next? Well, I see some like terms here. I have a positive 12 and a minus 4. Those are constants that can be combined. So the next tool I'm going to pull out of my toolbox is combining like terms. If I have a positive 12 minus a 4, those combine to a positive 8. So now my equation is 9x plus 8 equals 53. So I've used my distributive property and I've used my combining like terms. I'm going to leave it up to you to continue solving this using your properties of equality. So I finished solving this equation using SPO, subtraction property of equality, to create a zero term, giving me 9x equals 45, and division property DPO to create a big one, and I ended up with x equals 5. But of course, we have to check our work. So I'm going to go ahead and check now.
Okay, 3 times 5 is 15, plus 4 minus 4 equals 53. 15 plus 4 is 19, minus 4 equals 53. 3 times 19 is 57. 57 minus 4 is
53. So since this is a true equation, I know that x equals 5 is the correct solution. So here we have 5 times the group of 3x plus 4 minus 5x equals 60. So the first thing I'm going to do is put my line down the middle of my equal sign to keep both sides separate. Now I'm going to take a look at my toolbox and figure out what tools am I going to use. Will we use combine like terms here? Well, I notice there's a 3x inside of parentheses and a 5x outside of parentheses, and those are like terms, which leads me to believe that yes, at some point we will be using the combining like terms tool. Do you see parentheses here? Absolutely do, which means at some point I will also be using the distributive properties, and because we've got a mixture of variable terms and constants, we'll be making some big ones and zero terms using properties of equality. So let's get started. First thing that I'm going to do is get rid of my parentheses because I can't combine terms if they're stuck inside of those groups. So to do that, I'm going to distribute and simplify. 5 times 3x is a 15x. 5 times 4 is a positive 20. And then bring down my other terms. Minus 5x equals 60. So I've used my distributive property tool. What would come next here? Well, I have some options. I could go into my properties of equality next and subtract that 20 from both sides. In fact, I'm going to do that because I see that 20 is in between my like terms, and I'd like to get it out of there so I can actually see what like terms I have. So I'm going to go a little out of order here and do my subtraction property of equality next, followed by simplify. So what would that give me? Well, 20 minus 20 is a 0 term. So on the left-hand side of the equation, I'm left with 15x minus 5x. And on the right side, I have 40. So that's just an option. If you wanted to use the combining like terms tool first, you totally could have. Why don't you go ahead and finish solving this equation on your own now? Great. So to finish, I used my combining like terms tool. 15x minus 5x is 10x. Then I used my division property of equality to create a big 1, and I ended up with x equals 4. Let's go ahead and check.
5 times 3 times 4 is 12 plus 4 minus 5 times 4 is 20 equals 60. That's 5 times 16 minus 20 equals 60. 5 times 16 is 80. 80 minus 20
equals 60, and 60 does equal 60, which means 4 was the correct solution all along. All right, final example on this page. 7 equals 3 times the group of 2x minus 4 minus 5x. I'm going to start by putting the line down the middle of my equal sign. Okay, what tools am I going to use here? Do I see any like terms? Yes, I see a 2x that's stuck inside of a group and a 5x outside of the parentheses, which means eventually, once I get rid of the parentheses, I can use my combining like terms tool. Speaking of parentheses, if you see parentheses, then that means you're going to be using the distributive property. And of course, as you might have guessed, we're almost always using our properties of equality to create big 1s and 0 terms. Now I'm going to let you try this one on your own. Complete your solving, your reasons, and your check now. Quick recap. So solving multi-step equations pretty much means you're going to be using all your tools in your toolbox, or at least most of them. So to determine if there's a combining like terms tool, you're looking for like terms on the same side. Those like terms could be variables or constants. Again, constant means it doesn't have a variable. To determine if you're going to use the distributive property tool, you look for parentheses. And properties of equality are used to create 0 terms and big 1s, keeping the equation true while you're doing so. That's it for today's lesson. I will see you next time.